Hey guys, welcome back to America Copenhagen. Today's video is a history video. Specifically, today's video is for anyone with Danish American ancestry or who is simply interested in the history of Danish people migrating to the US. For example, did you know that at one point, 1/10 of the entire population of Denmark left the country to go emigrate? I'll be specifically focusing on the mass migration that happened in the 1800s from over here in Denmark over to the United States. And I'm going to take you on a little tour around the exact harbor that your ancestors very likely departed from. It's a really neat place because there's hundreds of names of real people who emigrated etched literally in the cobblestones. So keep watching and see if you maybe recognize your last name. It could be a relative of yours that you never knew was memorialized here in Copenhagen. So let's jump right in and have a walk around this harbor I want to show you. This one here is called Amerikakaj, which in English means America Quay. While Nyhavn is the famous Copenhagen harbor that everyone knows, by the time of the mass migration in the mid to late 1800s, Nyhavn was way too small for the large steamships that were being made at the time to transport the huge quantities of passengers and all their belongings to the New World. So instead, ships destined for North America would depart from here, and if you have a Danish ancestor who departed from Copenhagen, they probably walked where I'm walking right now. Today, it's quite a sleepy little harbor with not much life, but once upon a time, millions of people passed along these same cobblestones. If you walk about halfway up the harbor, you start to see names popping up on the cobblestones. These are the names of people who emigrated from Denmark, as well as the name of their hometown and the date of their departure. It's quite bittersweet that the city literally marked the names of those departed into stone, right here where they likely would have taken their last ever steps on Danish soil. It really gives a sense of what must have been a mixture of excitement for their new life, but also sadness for family members, friends they were leaving behind. The stones are a nice way for Denmark to say, we didn't forget you, your roots are here. You'll also notice this statue over here of a little girl. Her hair is being blown back from a strong headwind, and she's looking out towards the sea. This statue was based on a real person, a Danish girl called Christina, who emigrated with her family to Utah in 1866. In fact, it was sculpted by her grandson, Danish American sculptor Dennis Smith. Now, all this begs the question, why? Why did so many Danes leave their country, and specifically why America? A huge draw for America-bound Danes was the Homestead Act of 1862, which promised land to whomever could make the journey out there and claim it for a small filing fee. For thousands of working or even middle-class Danes who had no hope of ever owning land of their own, this was an unbelievable offer. In return, you just had to promise you'd cultivate the land, for example, use it for farming or whatever, and also to commit to stay for 5 years, after which you could also apply for American citizenship. At that time in Denmark, there had been a huge increase in the population, which led to high levels of unemployment, because there simply weren't enough jobs for everybody. Add to that, rising housing and living costs, owning a home was just simply out of reach for hundreds of thousands of Danes. Often you'd have a situation where there was maybe a family farm or something, but of course only the eldest child would inherit it, leaving all the rest of the children with no hope of ever owning land of their own. So what did they have to lose? The first big wave of Danish immigrants came in the 1850s, consisting mainly of Danish Mormons. It's estimated that between 1850 and the early 1900s, there were 17,000 total Danish Latter-day Saints who emigrated to the US. They weren't being religiously persecuted here in Denmark, it was more the draw of fellow Mormons starting to set up base in the newly acquired state of Utah, which had been under Mexican control until 1848. The rest were largely whole families moving over together. In fact, during the 1870s, almost half of all those emigrating were in family units. but by the 1890s, family immigration only made up roughly 25% of the inbound passengers. The rest were largely young, single men looking to maybe spend a couple years out there working, making way more money than they ever could in Denmark, and then ultimately returning home. Now, to put all of this into context for you, in the early 1900s, one ticket from Denmark to the US would have cost around 90 kroner, which is around 6,400 Danish kroner or a little over $1,000 today. So if you think about a poor family from the countryside, that is a huge upfront cost that they have to come up with. And of course, that doesn't include travel to the departing ship or any travel stateside to get to their final destination. But once they got all their affairs and finances in order, they would have likely departed from America Quay that I showed you earlier. The departures would have been a bustling, festive affair. Each boat had their own live orchestra who would play upon departure and arrivals. This worked to provide a happy, positive atmosphere, rather than having a depressing, sad one, saying goodbye to your family and homeland with so much uncertainty ahead. Journey times depended a little on what time period people traveled in, but to give you an idea of what the journey was like, during Christina's time, remember the statue of the little girl? When she went in the 1860s, it took them 52 days to cross the Atlantic. During her journey, 12 people died, 7 were married, and 2 were born. Sadly, just 10 days before arriving in New York City, Christina's only brother was one of the 12 who died and was buried at sea. What an unimaginable way to start your new life in a strange new country. Later, as ships got faster, the journey times were drastically cut down to more around 8 or 9 days, so it became a lot more comfortable for passengers. Here you can see some examples from inside of the actual ships that sailed the Copenhagen to New York route. As you can see, while the first class cabins are obviously fancier, the third class rooms are still really nice themselves. Their dining rooms had waiters and attendants just like the other higher classes, so it must have been quite the exciting experience getting to travel in such a luxurious ship. Upon arrival, everyone would have been processed at Ellis Island, where all new immigrants were taken. In fact, at the highest point of immigration to the US, there were 5,000 to 7,000 people from all over the world passing through the island each day. The exact numbers of how many Danes emigrated to the US vary quite a bit across the sources I found, but the most common number I saw was a staggering 300,000 immigrants between the dates of 1850 to around 1914. That equates to 1/10 of the country's population at the time. Just imagine 1 in every 10 people you know all moving away at once. The biggest year for Danish immigration was in 1882, when 11,618 Danish citizens left Denmark for greener pastures. Danes predominantly settled in Utah, California, Wisconsin, Iowa, Nebraska, Minnesota, and Illinois. Most of the settlers became farmers, some were bakers or carpenters. There were a few who tried, unsuccessfully, to tap into the American beer market, but it was already pretty heavily saturated by the German and Czech immigrants by that point. Today, there are approximately 1.3 million Americans of Danish descent or origin living in the United States. The forefathers brought with them a number of Danish foods you might recognize today. 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗛𝗟, 𝗘𝗩𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗛𝗟, and of course the famous Danish pastry called wienerbrød here in Denmark. Of course, I'm sure most of what you'd find of this stuff in the US today would be pretty different to what you'd find here in Denmark. But I guess that's also what makes up the Danish American experience. These things evolve over time and eventually become their own thing. As for the language, the numbers I found on this are super out of date, so take this as a very rough guide. But there's a little under 30,000 people in the US who still speak Danish at home today. It's a tricky one because Danes were a community that really quickly assimilated into their new American life. Because even back then, they were still a relatively small community, especially if you compare them to the Swedes or Norwegians who immigrated around the same time. There simply weren't as many Danish speakers, so they were kind of forced to blend in with their new surroundings and just use English. On top of that, there were all those young single guys I mentioned earlier traveling to the US for work opportunities. Many of them would have eventually met and settled down with local girls, having American children, which just further diminished their need to use Danish. I found a really interesting article about contemporary Danish American language. like how those who speak it today use it in a way that maybe Danes today would consider strange or incorrect, just like grammatical errors or using unusual word choices. A Dane could understand everything they said perfectly fine, but the language has just evolved into its own thing. I'll put a link down in the episode description below if you're a language nerd like me and find this kind of thing fascinating. Okay, so here's some Danish American trivia for you. The hamburger was allegedly invented by a Dane called Louis Lassen, who had emigrated to Connecticut. He's recognized in the US Library of Congress as the official inventor of the hamburger, which apparently came about in response to a hurried customer who wanted a hot lunch to go. Of course, it's one of those food things where loads of different people claim they actually invented it, but he's the one who's most officially recognized as inventing it. Actors Viggo Mortensen and Scarlett Johansson both have Danish fathers. I even found some Danish newspaper articles that state Scarlett even has a Danish passport, although she apparently can't speak any Danish beyond 𝗖𝗢𝗘𝗥𝗬𝗧𝗛𝗏, which means I love you. There's a whole Danish-themed city in California called Solvang, which is 140 miles north of LA. It was founded by a group of Danish teachers in 1911 and calls itself the Danish capital of America. The city features old-fashioned timber frame houses, a small-scale round tower and Little Mermaid statue, as well as Danish bakeries, restaurants, a brewery, and a Danish-style Lutheran church. And finally, there's not one but 2 Danish language newspapers still printed in the US today. The first one, founded in 1872, is called Den Danske Pioneer, or the Danish Pioneer. And the second one is called Bien, which translates to the bee in English, and was founded in 1882. There's an online archive I found of copies of their old issues going all the way back to the 1800s. For those interested, I'll put a link down below in the episode description. I'll warn you though, even if you're fluent in Danish, the old style font is really hard to read. It was for me at least. They use that really old ornate Germanic font, but in like really small font sizes. Thanks so much for watching today. This is far from an exhaustive historical summary of the Danish American experience, but hopefully you found it interesting all the same. For those of you who are Danish American or Canadian, do you know the story of how your family made the journey and got settled over in North America? Did you grow up with any Danish traditions or language? I'd love to hear from you down in the comments. Thanks again and see you next time.